Hello, and welcome back to our online lecture on Pan-Africanism in World War I. My hope for the second part of the lecture is to really bring all of this together. So we began by talking about sort of global racial conditions in the 19th century due to the end of transatlantic slavery in the Western Hemisphere, coupled with the proliferation of sorry about all my pop-ups coming up, the proliferation of imperialism going on across the globe and particularly in Africa. As we've talked about before, there are, of course, people throughout Africa are resisting European imperialism in a number of ways, from full-on warfare to, again, women warriors, leaders, emerging to the beginnings of even political parties and trying to articulate rights in the same way as the Europeans are implementing them. In the United States, examples of these types of groups would be the NAACP and the United Negro Improvement Association, or the UNIA led by Marcus Garvey. Both are civil rights organizations. They both want racial equality, but they are achieving them in very different ways. World War I becomes, both in the United States and globally, a great big question to answer in terms of, will participation in a war meant to create greater opportunities for democracy really lead to both civil rights in the United States as well as civil rights for people of color around the world? People of color, both around the world and in the United States, see the First World War as the opportunity to make the world racially equal. There are also those, both in the United States and globally, who believe that this will not happen, that the forces of white supremacy that are creating industrialism, imperialism, nationalism will limit opportunities for full equality. So World War I is a pivotal moment, as in some ways opportunities are opening up in the United States for greater racial acceptance. At the same time, we are also going to see science, the academy, and governments also articulate against racial equality. So a couple of things that are creating conditions for a global war. The long-term effects are, of course, creating World War I are industrialization, imperialism, and nationalism, as well as the growth of the alliance system, where, again, nations, countries are become involved with one another in military and political alliances. By the beginning of World War I, there are two specific alliances, right? And these alliances are also the same countries that control these global empires that are affecting Africa, the Middle East, and the rest of Asia. Oh, sorry. Okay. The beginning of the war comes with a assassination, and I'm not going to get too much into the assassination of Franz Ferdinand. As a low-level diplomat, he doesn't really mean anything. However, right, know two things. One is that these alliances were looking for an excuse to wage war on each other, and this became the perfect excuse to do that. And second, there have been decades of warfare in Eastern Europe, in Sub-Saharan Africa, in Asia, across, even on the border of the United States and Mexico, that have been going on for decades before the war actually breaks out. So we shouldn't ignore these small-scale wars that are going on, these civil conflicts over borders. World War I is also going to bring massive migration, massive displacement across Eastern Europe that creates conditions for the Second World War. So the problems that created the First World War are in no way solved. And it's only 20 years before another world war, very much about race, equality, and the lack of democracy, breaks out again. Um, as I mentioned in the first lecture, African American men, as well as men of color in colonized spaces throughout England, France, Germany, are um, and in Asia, are also asked to serve in colonial militias. For men in India who have been fighting for their rights against the British, they see this moment, right? As when they return, they will get equality. African American men in the United States see the same thing or hope the same thing. And that's not what's happening. As men are returning to the United States, there is an increase in lynchings across the country. And around 1917, well into 1919, there are a number of these riots that take place, many attacking African American soldiers in uniform. So, what's a signal that this service is not demonstrated? Lynching a man in uniform. For some African American veterans of the First World War who have the opportunity, they actually remain in France and in other places in Europe. This was known as the patriation movement, staying abroad rather than coming home to the United States. The author James Baldwin is an example of someone who did that. Um, Black culture was very popular in France, Belgium, and basically across Europe as well. And for some African Americans, there was the belief that there was a greater sense of acceptance in places like Paris than in, say, New York or certainly in the American South. And although that's a very popular idea, it also ran counter to the realities of French racial oppression. The French Empire controlled half of Africa, most of Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Cambodia, parts of Thailand, and across islands in the Pacific, where white supremacy was absolutely practiced and enforced. So it's an interesting tension or dichotomy that some people very much experience more freedom in France, and yet France was performing all of these racial atrocities across the globe. Um, After World War I, and Germany's going to be punished for basically starting the First World War. It has to give up much of its territory in Europe, but it also has to give up its territory in Africa. So former German colonies do not become free, they become part of British and French colonies. Um, One of the ideas of white supremacy that are unified across the globe is the practice of eugenics. Eugenics is now a disrespected form of racial science, but at the 20th century, it was very much believed as the popular form of scientific thinking, that races were in a hierarchy with whites on top, and civilizations supported this idea. You can see how eugenics is practiced in medicine, and that even according to the American Medical Association, that Black people could not feel pain in the same way that whites could. There was also the belief that you could look at someone and tell whether or not they were criminals. Certainly, according to the same type of thinking, Jews were much more susceptible to violence and crime. So there was the belief, again, that not only were there differences in physiology between races and cultures, but that you could detect quote unquote bad people by looking at them. So these are just a couple of ways that this is practiced in medicine and implemented as practice. And we'll look at some of these other techniques. So, according to eugenic science, of course, sterilization was a good idea, a good practice for people of color to try to maintain the population. And because people of color scientifically are inferior to whites, that is the practice according to eugenics. Um, Eugenics also believed that for those who were physically disabled, mentally disabled, or different from quote unquote the standard specimen, that those people should also um, either be experimented on, or we could take out parts of their brain, like in a lobotomy, to see what happened. Also, the idea that people in prison could be experimented on for the greater good because they were basically sitting around doing nothing. These are not only ideas practiced by doctors in the United States, but again across Western Europe. In the United States, we have examples of radiation experiments done on Black children, Black people, on poor white women who were often given all kinds of experimental treatments to see what would happen to their um, young fetus, or the developing fetus, rather. There are long lasting effects of scientific experiments. However, if we put the type of scientific experiments done in the United States in the 1930s side by side by the scientific experiments done by Nazi doctors, they would be absolutely the same. And that should give us pause for a moment, because as the US is going to also go to war against Nazi Germany in the 1930s to quote unquote make the world more democratic, it forces a very uncomfortable mirror of what's going on in the United States. In the 1930s, in many ways, as a response to World War I, and of course, the Great Depression of the 1930s that hits the entire world, you really see the emergence of fascism. And fascism is described, or rather defined, as a far right wing militaristic movement. It idealizes one type of citizen racially, um, and very much is about giving a ruler extreme um, control over the rest of the country. Um, Fascism is usually linked to some sort of media, as well as a way to connect to an audience. Um, really talking about how one country, one people is better than others, or why one group is responsible for all a country's ills. And of course, there are a number of examples of this throughout the 1930s. The National Socialists in Germany, i.e., the Nazi Party, becomes one of the best examples of a fascist movement. There is also the movement of fascist in Italy, led by Benito Mussolini. And they're arguing again that Italy should be only for those who are 100% Italian. So if you are immigrant, if you come from other parts of the Mediterranean, then you were not welcome in this movement. We see similar ideas, of course, in the United States. There are lots of Nazis in the United States in the 1930s. It is the era of Jim Crow. The KKK has reached one of its largest membership totals in the 1930s, and of course, there were also eugenic doctors. So the U.S. is doing a number of things. There's even a number of politicians who are saying very similar things about Jews and about race in the U.S. in the 1930s. Um, so we can't really separate Pan-Africanism, this articulation of of African, a celebration of African identity and Black racial awareness, is going on at the exact same time, of course, of the proliferation of white supremacy. They are operating on parallel tracks, but they're separate, I mean, very specific points of intersection between the two. Um, as you continue to think about the development of the First World War, remember, right? This is a war about fascism. This is a war about militarism. Can you get 1/3 of your country to go after the other third of your country? Um, Many people see similarities between fascism and these nationalist movements of the 21st century. I have not talked about the Spanish flu of 1918 either. That will You should certainly look into that as part of I think your extra credit assignments go over that. um, But World War II is going to be, if World War One is about race, World War II is about race. If World War One is about establishing or the potential to establish a more just world, so is World War II. Um, so let's think about how these things are related to global ideas about rights, equality, and a real shared idea of democracy. Uh, Thank you for listening, and let me know if you have any questions.